great-looking t-shirts, hoodies, and sweatshirts. The TNT shop is now open at tntradio.live. Deconstructing psyops, propaganda, and mainstream media garbage. Connecting the dots. You're with Matt Ehret and Connecting the Dots on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
All right, welcome back for the third hour of Connecting the Dots. I am very, very happy to be joined today by two very exceptional people who I've had the pleasure of chatting with now for a couple of years, Paul and Liz Fitzgerald. Now, Paul and Liz have a very, very unique bio. I'm going to just run through a couple of points that are of extra interest for me, and I think for anybody watching, is that these were the first American journalists to gain access to Afghanistan in 1981. They returned in 83, did incredible news stories for CBS as well as ABC, despite a huge amount of resistance from certain forces that were busy trying to get another image of what Afghanistan was embedded into the psyche of Americans, which Paul and Liz have talked about enormously in their articles, their books, their many, many interviews and lectures. This is very important because there was a total ban on Western journalists, a ban, and they were able to become the only trusted Western journalists to be presented, to see things on the ground and to get a real picture of what was going on. They've also written many books, of which we have The Voice, the Invisible History of Afghanistan, The Untold Story, Crossing Zero After the AfPak War, At the Turning Point of American Empire, Valediction, which I've read, Three Nights of Desmond, and the newest, Resurrection. Today, I wanted to just chat a little bit with Paul and Liz about a few of their insights, their backstory, and also a couple of articles that they've written, which we'll try to get as much content as possible, but we'll have links to the articles and the books in the description box under this video when it goes live later on. How are you guys doing today? Thank you so much for joining.
I think we're doing pretty good. We're looking forward to this very much, Matt.
Yeah,
nice
me
to
too.
see you again, Matt.
What's that, Paul?
I said it's nice to see you again. It always is.
Yeah. Now, you guys have been on the inside track on a lot of things, and I read through the three essays that you guys sent me and took a ton of notes. It's so all encompassing. We're going to see what we can do, but I figured I would begin with a quote. Well, here, let's do it this way. You brought up in the course of an article saying, "We are all CIA assets. What can be done? A personal story." And you bring about certain troubling discoveries you made over the years of the efforts and the role of the CIA in social engineering and in manipulating people's emotions to take something that was good, humanity, and confuse it to disrupt the flow of what would be a peace movement that would be in resistance to the Vietnam War. But despite that, despite the manipulation of things like MKUltra and other things, there has been still a very important, potent goodness that you guys participated in. And could you say a little something about what was both your discovery that was how did the CIA play a role in the process that you participated in, and what did you take out of that lesson?
I think it's we were both going through college and high school at the peak of the Vietnam War era, the protest movement and everything, late 1960s. I was at Boston University in 1969, and the police were there almost every day. There was some kind of protest going on. There were all kinds of things happening around us and whatnot. And at the end of my very last day of my first semester at Boston University in 1969, I got a call from my faculty advisor, and he called me up and he said, "I want you to come over to my apartment tonight." And I thought, that's unusual. Why your apartment? Why not your office? So anyway, I went and did it. And he said, "Have you ever considered working for your government?" And I thought to myself, well, how strange. But I had no idea that was part of what I was doing as a freshman at Boston University. So I later learned, of course, that Boston University was up to its ears in all kinds of activities, not just protest activities. They were not organizing the protest. The protests were going on about some of the things apparently that were going on at BU that I had no idea were going on. At any rate, it also so happened that that very day, I had gone over to, I had read in the Boston Globe that they were holding open auditions for the Boston production of the musical Hair. Now, Hair was, Hair was a landmark production at the time. And it was in a number of different cities. It was in LA, it was in New York, it was in London and Paris and Tokyo. It was a worldwide phenomenon, and it was expressing the kind of summary of what had happened at Woodstock a few months before. So at any rate, I was a singer, and I had been in lots of rock and roll groups, and I'd been in the Boston Opera Company as a singer when I was younger. So anyway, so I went over to I had gone over that very morning, I'd gone over to the Wilbur Theater and talked about auditions and signed up for an audition. So I told my faculty advisor, I said, I would like to do this show if I could get into it, So he said, oh, you don't want to do that. You've got, there's lots more important things for you to do than to be in something like that. But you can always tell people you did. So little by little, I came to realize our opening, I get in the show. I not only get in the show, they give me the lead. So here I am. I'm going back and forth to New York. I'm meeting all these people. One of the producers was closely related, friends with Peter, Paul, and Mary. So I'm going off to parties at Peter, Paul, and Mary's house. I'm 18 years old, and it's like this whole new world is opening up to me. And I did not know at the time that Peter Yarrow's father was running I believe it was one of the government propaganda agencies, the U.S. government propaganda agencies. And he was the central focus. He'd created it, back in the 1950s. And I thought to myself, Radio Free Europe, I think it was. And I thought to myself, this is really getting very strange. But, there was never any effort on their behalf to try to, get us to slant the story or slant the show, or we'd have Vietnam veterans coming up on the stage and giving us their medals to put up there because they were so, they were proud of their service and they wanted people. We had, comments from lots of people, a lot of military people were coming into the show and, we were helping them get through this terrible thing that they'd gone through.
I'd like to add one quick
please.
Point as history to set up, Liz. Actually, it turned out that that's where Paul and I met. And I always kind of considered that the show was really not only an education that we ultimately were able to look back at, basically, decades later and begin to understand this process of infiltration by the CIA into every aspect of what we were engaged in. It really started at the entire educational system was really pulled in in 1953 with the activation of the Cultural Cold War. So, but these were all things as we were living through it, we didn't know any of these things at all.
Or that it was all coordinated somehow by the cultural, this thing called the Cultural Cold War.
But what we did notice was that there was something powerfully authentic about the Hair experience. And doing it for a year really gave, and that Paul was the one who was in the show. I actually was not part of the show, but I had a lot of friends that I knew who were in the show. So I was there a lot. And then, of course, when Paul and I started dating, I was there even more. But the point being that the experience of feeling the sense of the reality of the anti-war movement, that we were a generation that was speaking a truth that was being heard, that we were affecting things. And it certainly didn't happen overnight. The process clearly developed over, certainly from, obviously the original engagement in Vietnam that culminated in 1975. But by the time this would have been 1970. So it was really kind of at the height of the growing anti-war movement. And it felt so real and powerful. And then to actually get the result that we thought we wanted. I mean, at that time, you have to understand that we thought that when they were ending the draft, it was like they were ending war. We didn't think of it as, turning our basically American boys into effectively mercenary.
But kids don't
effect.
realize it today. I mean, you had that hanging over your head from the time you were 16 years old until you either went in the army or got a deferment of some kind. And you could go to college for a couple of years, but you had to go to your local draft board and appeal to them to do that. So your life was not your own. So that was,
there's definitely an atmosphere of terror that we take for granted. People who are younger than you guys and didn't live through it, it's hard to imagine the type of feeling of terror that constantly was being lived in as your friends and relatives are coming in body bags back into America for a war that they didn't even understand. Why are we there? No, I can imagine sorry, go on. No, keep the thought going. I don't want to derail you.
The only point I wanted to make, though, in terms of this feeling and this sense of success, was that when the entire process was complete, there was something missing, that we weren't really sure what actually happened to the whole peace movement. It seemed to just disappear at some level, but we weren't conscious of it at the time. We didn't actually really look back at this, as researchers until 2016, because we had another motivation to want to go into what that experience was about and write about it. And it was shocking when we saw it. This is actually, is this the one? Well, anyway, this is the David McGowan's book, is the one that really gave us the basic information about the Laurel Canyon music industry and its creation. And a lot
for those just listening to this on the radio, what we just saw was the cover of a book called Weird Scenes from Laurel Canyon, a highly important book, which Paul and Liz wrote some incredible articles about. But yeah, go on.
Yeah, so that as we were beginning to peel it away, and I will make one point, that book and none of the books we've used for research mention specifically anything about hair being at all involved in this process of manipulation. We have no basis on which to say it definitely was a total CIA operation or how it was effected. We have no way of knowing. But what we did realize was that the actual process that had taken over guaranteed that the very essence of the peace movement would be completely removed. And one of the tactics, we believe, was actually part of it was turning it into a hippie, drug-based, la-la kind of thing. It was really not real. Peace, love, tra-la was the joke line. And so, in having lived through it, we couldn't see anything like that. But at the end of the day, when you went into the 70s, and of course, this is where the transition for us happened. In 1976, Jimmy Carter gets elected. It's on a peace platform. The Vietnam War is supposed to be over. The devastation of the Vietnam War so impacted the bureaucracy that there was a huge push for détente and for trying to develop better relations with the Soviet Union so we could move into more of a peaceful competition.
Not to mention the ravages to the economy.
Right, exactly. So this was supposed to be, and we were very involved at that time with the political process. So we were engaged with a lot of people who were in the Democratic Party, especially at the time with Jimmy Carter. And it was unbelievable what happened. 1976, Jimmy Carter gets elected. And in 1979, he inaugurated the idea of the greatest threat to peace since the Second World War, following the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Well, at that moment, what Paul and I witnessed was the entire collapse of the idea of peaceful negotiations, the idea of détente being furthered. All the people that we had been working with, and we had done a documentary at that time about it with John Galbraith. So we were very involved with the people who were really trying very hard to get this going. And it was as if they all just, they just walked out the door and said, it's over. The Soviets just blew it. What do you mean? What are you talking about? The Soviet Union had crossed the border into a country that was so tiny and so unknown. People didn't even know where it was on the map. It was actually on their southern border. They had the Muslim republics abutted Afghanistan. it had actually always been considered in the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union because the U.S. had chosen Pakistan as its business partner in the region. And so there just were a lot of questions in our minds saying, what just happened? How did that event go from what it appeared to be was some kind of, it was serious, certainly 75,000 troops crossing the border was clearly serious, but somehow turning it into the greatest threat to peace since the Second World War was, kind of.
Well, once again, too, it seemed to come out of nowhere.
Yes. Yeah.
It just seemed to. I mean, I had a talk show on in Boston on of all places, the Christian Broadcasting Network. I was their non-denominational equal time guy. I would go on with a half-hour show once a week, and I would bring on people that they would never bring on to the show, and they would talk about things. And that's how we got our documentary up and running. They were running something put out by the American Security Council called the SALT Syndrome, and it was about the problem, the inherent problem of negotiating anything with the Soviet Union, because the Soviets were evil, they were bad, and their station was running, it was Pat Robertson's station, he was running it 3 or 4 times a day. So it was like I went to the general manager and I said, look, I said, I'm your equal time guy, and I said, you're running this documentary without providing a counterpoint. So anyway, so they said, all right, here, go out and go and talk to some people, do something. Anyway, so we put together a documentary, and I had enough political connections at that point from our political work that we'd done in 76 and 77. So to be able to get some top level people, and John Galbraith and Paul Warnke, the man who'd negotiated the SALT II treaty, was quite willing to talk to us. So anyway, we put together a half-an-hour documentary called The Arms Race and the Economy, A Delicate Balance, because nobody was thinking about the economy. And then all of a sudden, the program aired, I think, in December, and then all of a sudden, January 1st, the Soviets are in Afghanistan, and it's all over. Yeah. Peace is all over. Détente's over.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's do this. I think you guys have set the stage so nicely for what I really want to go into, which will touch upon the emergence of this neocon weird virus that took over control of a lot of U.S. foreign policy, and a figure named Robert Moss, who is also, I think, going to be a bridge in a certain sense of these two worlds, cultural warfare and geopolitical manipulations, very nicely. So we'll do that when we come back from a short break. This is TNTRadio.live.
TNT's Darren Denslow.
Yeah, I'm talking about the illness. Actually, that has been doing the rounds. Not have we only seen a mass influx of people waving their COVID tests online. Look, I got a red line. It's like, oh my God, we're still testing. Or people, trying to encourage others to wear their masks. But there has been a talk of a dry cough. There have been doctors coming out saying we've seen loads of cases of that. Have you been suffering from, a bit of cough and flu or cold or COVID?
Well, Darren,
COVID.
I just did my 8th test, I'm just going to keep doing it until I get lines and lines. Why? Well, because work's coming back up, isn't it?
Digging deeper with D.D. Denslow on today's News Talk, TNT.
Military families often sacrifice precious time away from loved ones while serving our country. And for those with children, the separation can be especially difficult.
We were worried that with him leaving, that she would lose those connections with her dad.
Some of life's best moments happen between parents, children, and the pages of a good book. United Through Reading provides that connection.
You can watch your mom or dad read a book to you, and it almost feels like they're really there.
We ensure they remain a consistent, meaningful part of their children's lives, no matter the distance.
Just seeing Jacob recognize Daddy again after a long time just melted my heart.
And now, as we're facing greater isolation from our loved ones, United Through Reading is also available to veterans. Learn more about United Through Reading and download our free secure app at unitedthroughreading.org.
We don't rock, we talk. Today's News Talk, TNT Radio.
All right, we're back for the second segment of the third hour with Paul and Liz Fitzgerald. We were, before going into the commercial break, describing a little bit of the what seems to be two separate things, but they're actually one thing with two aspects, which is, on the one hand, the artificial intervention of the CIA and intelligence agencies in cultural warfare that shaped many of those who lived in the 1960s, who loved the music, who loved the drugs a little bit too much in some cases, and who fell prey to a lot of manipulation, but at the same time still acted as humans should act in times of injustice and did a lot to organize against this imperial war, while at the same time there was this other thing taking over the US government, over the dead bodies of great patriots like John F. Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King, many others, of which Paul and Liz got a firsthand seat, and in some cases were able to write very extensive exposés on ambassadors of the United States, different officials around Ted Kennedy, who were trying to restore some sense of sanity and didn't live to accomplish it. That being said, this geopolitical thing, this what became, I guess, later on identified as the neocons, were emerging onto the scene and overseeing what became Islamic fundamentalism as a manipulation in Afghanistan, but more broadly, and you were just touching on Pakistan playing a role and other things. Would you be able to say a little bit more now about how these two worlds were part of the same thing, maybe touching on the figure of Robert Moss, who you've spoken about?
Well, Robert Moss is a wonderful link between this kind of esoteric world that we, encountered, as well as the intelligence angle. It seemed that, that when it came to the Middle East, and when it came to the Near East, when it came to Afghanistan, Pakistan, whatever, the United States really didn't have any experts in that area. I mean, they had people who kind of remotely understood it and, dabbled with it periodically, but their real experience was the British experience, and they looked to Britain for their expertise. Britain had run the empire out of India for a long time, and they were still interested in it. They left Pakistan when they left the empire, and they dissolved the kingdom, as it were. There, they wound up having a lot of leaving Pakistan is like a military base. I mean, the joke was at the time is that most countries have a military. Pakistan is a military that has a country. So it's and it's true. I mean, and that also goes for the Taliban. Chuck Hogan, the director of the Near East South Asia division at the CIA, referred to them, told us personally. He said, the Taliban are a wholly owned subsidiary of Pakistani intelligence. So whatever they do, whatever they say, it's coming from the Commonwealth. It's coming from MI6. It's coming from the British intelligence angle on it. So at this point, so that was something that this guy, Robert Moss, was one of these intelligence people.
He was Australian.
But he was working with
British intelligence.
He was working,
and CIA.
Yeah. So, and he would be putting out, and he and Arnaud de Borchgrave wrote a book called The Spike, and got the whole thing kicked off. That was kind of like the publicity thing for it, and it got a lot of publicity. It's really a, what do they call it, Roman à clef type thing, and it was a thinly disguised story about a reporter who really was working for the Russians or the communists. And in Vietnam, it was really an agent, but was taking advantage of the weaknesses of the free press in the West, and you're pulling the wool over everyone's eyes in New York and Washington and the American public, and so it was exposing the people who were trying to expose what was really going on. It was a counterintelligence operation. So at any rate,
wow. That's exactly what we're seeing again today, right? Anybody who's questioning CIA foreign strategy or anything is all of a sudden a Russian disinformation agent. So this is like a blueprint laid out by Moss and Arnold back in the early 70s.
Well, there is actually a little background story that will help set up Moss as how significant he was, especially with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Because it was Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was President Carter's national security advisor, who really kicked off the whole infiltration of the total bureaucracy with the neocons, with his tricking the Soviets into Afghanistan. Because when the Team B, which was basically a challenge to the traditional CIA Team A analysis, Team B was accepted by George Bush, who at the time was head of the CIA, to come in. These were outsiders who were really very well-known, powerful neocons. That we now know that's what all of them are.
Yeah, Wolfowitz and Paul Nitze and that whole neocon Straussian crew. Yeah.
Yep. Right, but they're all outsiders, but they were given permission to go in and analyze the CIA for Soviet threat. And what they came up with was a prophecy that predicted that the Soviet Union in 1975 is going to cross the border into some tiny little country and prove basically to the world their claim. They really want to just take over the world. So Brzezinski gets into office in 1976 with Carter, and the first thing he does in January when they start the administration is he starts fomenting the southern border of the Soviet Union to start the process of forcing the Soviets to have to cross the border into Afghanistan effectively. And so when it actually happened, okay, now this is January 1977. So here it happens in December of 1979. And President Carter, oh my goodness, the greatest threat to peace since the Second World War, when in fact his national security advisor, and known to him, was actually intentionally setting up what they ultimately called the Soviet Union's Vietnam. They wanted to put them in a situation that would be similar to the way the U.S. was kind of trapped in Vietnam. So this became the basis on which a propagandist like Robert Moss was feeding into. And he worked hand in glove with a guy like Brzezinski. They were all basically, in on the propaganda.
He would put out papers, in terms of, and publish things and through his connections in London. And he would get things into the press, through Rupert Murdoch and people like that specifically. And so then Zbigniew Brzezinski would take that and then go around the White House and to all the NS national security people and say, see, here's my proof. I've got it in print. Here it is. The Russians are this. The Russians have intentions of doing this and that and everything else. And so what was so interesting about the Team B is that the Team B was composed essentially of all of these old Trotskyists who'd rebranded themselves as neoconservative, new kind of conservative. Okay. And this is what they've done over and over and over again. And they never go away. They implant themselves. They've got a little network of their own all through the government at this point, and they've influenced the U.S. military, and they've influenced the national security agencies, and we've got 21 security agencies, and that's you say, well, how the whole Russiagate thing that just happened, how could that have happened? And when it was finally investigated by the Senate Intelligence Committee, they said there was nothing there about Trump, as an example. Okay. Yeah. And the fact is that, it wasn't that Trump wasn't talking to the Russians. I mean, he was the president after all for 4 years. He's supposed to do stuff like that. But they turned everything into a propaganda ploy. And so this is what we're living with right now, because they kind of run the string out, I think, at this point. But the thing about the Trotskyists that I wanted to point out was the fact that Trotsky's objective was, his code was get control no matter what. And once you've got control, keep it.
But the real bottom line here for the neocons was that they had always been nipping at the sidelines, and they had an effect, but they weren't inside the system until Brzezinski pulled off the casus belli that they have still living off of, which was the Soviets crossing the border into a little country that they could claim meant they were going to take over
and
the
trapping them in Afghanistan had been kicking around the CIA for years at that point. So it was no surprise.
I think that what you guys are touching on as far as a nerve of world history is so important for people to really think about and study and really process, because especially the Trotsky element, as far as like, where does this neocon warmongering fanaticism arise? What's its origin? And it comes from a bunch of revolutionary permanent revolution Trotskyists that couldn't keep power in Russia, got kicked out, reorganized, rebranded themselves, put on new lipstick, and all of a sudden came out as anti-Soviet Cold Warriors that then took over like a virus the Republican Party. And I mean, then now increased the Democratic Party. So it's so important to appreciate.
I think it's more like a parasite. I think parasite is more like
Let's
It's
go with
better.
parasite. Yeah, I don't know what a virus
Right.
is anymore either. So okay, let's go
Right,
parasite. Sure.
Well, I
Um,
do. So,
yeah,
the
go ahead.
idea that this was, but that the point being that they actually have no loyalty except to
Yeah.
control and permanent war. And I think we now this is why we are in the circumstances that we are in today.
Yes.
But the permanent
On the issue of Robert Moss, and he's gonna he plays such a I ordered a few of his books. I listened to a few of his interviews. He's such an it's an interesting gateway that it gives you insight into, right? Because many people know of Moss as being a dream guru who's worked high level at Esalen. He's also, I mean, that's how they think of him, as somebody who helps you explore your dreams and other things. And he's like the spiritualist guru. Esalen, just as a quick side note, I've got this book I was reading. I just finished it by Jeffrey Kripal on the history of Esalen, which has a whole chapter on how Lawrence Rockefeller played a key role in funding the U.S.-Soviet peace program starting in the 70s at Esalen. So it was Esalen that was processing Yeltsin, Gorbachev, Russian mystics coming in, working with the KGB to create this controlled disintegration of the Soviet Union, while at the same time, Esalen-connected operatives are working to manipulate the drug culture of the hippies. At the same time, you have people like Robert Moss, a Cold Warrior himself, who's also interfacing, playing a controlled opposition game, providing the social engineering and other things to bring in the neocon Straussian apparatus. Very fascinating thing. How did you guys discover Robert Moss, and how does he play into this broader picture?
That's a fascinating little aspect of this. Robert Moss we knew about because of our research into the Soviet issue,
and because of the spike.
And we knew about the people who had basically been the propagandists, and he was one of the major ones, along with Brian Crozier. And they brought all this to Washington. They actually activated an agency that many of the neocons, including Brzezinski, became a part of. So there was a lot of back and forth going on. But what happened was, in 2007, I believe it was, there was a magazine called Parade, which came with our Boston Globe. It was a national magazine. It was kind of well known that it was
an insert.
It was an insert, but it was kind of well known. It was in newspapers all across the country as a part of the Sunday paper. But it was kind of well known that it had ties to the agency. It had ties to the intelligence community.
What the CIA wanted you to think.
Right. Well, it turned out they had a story about Robert Moss being a dream guru.
And what a wonderful guy.
And we're like, what? What happened to Robert Moss?
That couldn't be the same Robert Moss.
That would be,
not the one we
Well,
know.
not only that, but then we obviously did an investigation, and we found the website for Robert Moss, who's now a dream guru. And there wasn't one mention anywhere about his background as an intelligence operative. And we were, a little bit surprised that, obviously, and of course, now if you go to Wikipedia and look up Robert Moss, there's not one mention about any of that in Wikipedia. You've got to go to the Wiki. What's the other one, Paul?
WikiSpooks.
WikiSpooks. WikiSpooks has the real Robert Moss. But so this was part of our education and seeing the infiltration again. Robert Moss not only was a high-level propagandist, this guy, we have no doubt, going into the dream world, we're talking about militarized dreaming. We're talking about how these groups basically are literally infiltrating people at a level that most people have no idea that it can really happen. And we've all seen, the hypnotist who turns one person who comes to the event into a chicken for a moment, who claimed he couldn't be hypnotized. They always make a joke about it. But, and I guess people don't realize it's actually real, that you don't know how they can really infiltrate you through this dream process. And Robert Moss is in there, apparently. We suspect this is, what we assume is going on. He's basically bringing people to his cause, and they become, part of his team. All right. And you might remember in our article, there was a story about one woman who he clearly did not want on his team. And she suspected it was because she was too strong. She was too strong-willed. And he didn't want anybody like that on his team.
Yeah, that's good. No, I think what we'll do, I think this sets up again. I love the way that these little segments are developing in a very organic way, because this sets up, I think, the place we want to take this, or I'd like to take this, when we come back from a commercial break, dealing with the question of the dream factory that is the CIA-sponsored Hollywood as a whole, and mystical imperialism a little bit more in depth. So we're going to come back on TNTRadio.live with more with Paul and Liz Fitzgerald.
The challenges our planet's animals are facing sometimes feel a bit heavy.
Animals haven't eaten in a day, 2 days, they haven't drank anything, they're cold, they're dehydrated.
As soon as we started our descent, everywhere I could see was mud. Just absolutely mud.
The country has been in prolonged drought for so long, it was like a tinderbox waiting to go up.
Okay, very heavy. Each of us wants to be part of the solution, and we can be. Remember that there's good happening right now. At home.
All right, we were able to get into your unit, and we have all 4 of your cats. So,
okay.
And around the world. For any animal in any disaster. So let's focus on that, right? Be part of the solution, one rescue at a time. Search ifa.org/disaster ready. The challenges our planet's animals are facing sometimes feel a bit heavy.
Animals haven't eaten in a day, 2 days, they haven't drank anything, they're cold, they're dehydrated.
As soon as we started our descent, everywhere I could see was mud. Just absolutely mud.
The country has been in prolonged drought for so long, it was like a tinderbox waiting to go up.
Okay, very heavy. Each of us wants to be part of the solution, and we can be. Remember that there's good happening right now. At home.
All right, we were able to get into your unit, and we have all 4 of your cats. So,
okay.
And around the world. For any animal in any disaster. So let's focus on that, right? Be part of the solution, one rescue at a time. Search ifa.org/disaster ready.
Matt Ehret and Connecting the Dots on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
All right, we're back for the third segment of the third hour with Paul and Liz Fitzgerald. We're tying together a bunch of moving parts into a higher unity increasingly, and getting our minds into a place where we don't get myopic. I mean, there's a problem that I think a lot of people have when they're trying to analyze complex systems, of which we are a part. You know, we've got culture, or economics, geopolitics, different categories you could look at individually, but you would be incompetent to do so because each part is shaped by a whole. And so there's this important exercise that we're in, of lateral thinking, of learning how to think about many different things that are different aspects of one thing. Now we are dealing with the culture, the arts, the CIA, Hollywood. We were touching on the question of hypnotic techniques to pull people to create altered states in both individuals and in groups. We're talking about Robert Moss, somebody who was behind on the vanguard of the rise and takeover of big chunks of our establishment by this Trotskyist Straussian thing that wants absolute power and permanent war, permanent revolution. We're talking about all of these different elements, good people who didn't want World War III, who were iced out of decision-making processes in the 60s and 70s for a variety of things that Paul and Liz were watching as it was happening, and then thinking back on what made this happen. So the Robert Moss figure being somebody who's this dream guru, somebody who's high-level grand strategy, or at least plays a very influential role in grand strategy. And you guys were talking about the idea of the power of dreams. And in one of your articles, forgetting which one, you make the point, is the New Age movement being secretly penetrated, and are willing victims aware that they may at some future date be used as weapons? I think that was a very powerful question to get people to subjectively introspect a bit and think about what are the subtle influences that might be shaping me that I haven't thought about yet. Could you elaborate a little bit more on the question of Hollywood as a dream factory, as mass hypnosis techniques are operating, and what you meant by that statement in any way you see fit?
Okay. This whole thing really got kicked off in 1953 with this CIA memo called PSP 332. And it was, you can get it, it's online. You can get it at the CIA website, at least an abridged version of it anyway. And Frances Stonor Saunders talks about it in her book about the Cold War. It's really quite a document, because what it's doing is basically it's proposing a kind of ideology for the West in order to inspire people through media, through culture, to oppose Marxism. It was, Marxism was very popular after World War II. They saw the rise of fascism. They saw what the fascism had done, what industrialized capital had resorted to in terms of destroying Europe and destroying the Soviet Union and fighting the United States. So everyone was kind of alive to the idea that something new needed to be done. And there was a lot of favorability towards the Soviet Union. A lot of people in Europe, the communist parties in Italy and Germany and France looked towards the Soviet Union as the future. So the CIA said, we have to do something about this. So they carte blanche created this idea, and they supported a lot of magazines, a lot of articles.
It was even more than that. It actually was an infiltration into the educational system at the ground level. And that's why Paul was tapped at BU. These kinds of tappings happen starting in elementary school. You are already put on a track. You're already ID'd. The intelligence test that they give you is specifically to find certain kind of thinkers and then elevate them. So,
and your career was rooted into, just routed into a certain direction.
And this was part of the whole idea of the Cultural Cold War. It came in at the ground level. So and that's why it is in everything. That's why what Robert Moss ended up doing with the dream world, was a continuation of an already penetrated process. So I think at some level, we all have to just accept the fact that we've been inundated one way or another with this process. And in terms of the role that Hollywood plays, that's the ultimate role. Because Hollywood has the ability with a single film to literally establish a narrative. And that's what Hollywood did. I just want to make this one point to really make it clear, If your audience out there, if anyone has seen Charlie Wilson's War, and that's the only thing you know about Afghanistan, you have to accept the fact that what you basically know is the propaganda story.
That you've been totally propaganda.
Totally, That's the role of Hollywood, to create the narrative they want you to believe, period.
Yeah.
Now, once in a while, there's a true narrative that comes through. It's not that everything is completely opposite of what it is. But in the case of Afghanistan, I think, that one is a total propaganda piece.
But it's what we tried to do with Invisible History, Afghanistan's Untold Story, was thread the needle through the events that really did occur and these people who were put out there, so that, you could actually tell, it's like giving a scorecard to who the players were, and letting people know what was really going on. And we did get that accepted by the establishment, which we'd been up against since the 1980s.
But not for the average American. It gets into the academic system to a degree. And there are people who know much more about real history in these systems. But you can see what's happening now, where they reach a point where if you open your mouth, your job is gone.
Yeah, but we carried that story from the 1980s all the way until 2009, and City Lights Books finally got it published. But it took that long to get that clarity out of one issue, and that was Afghanistan, and that was only because the United States had invaded it.
But we can't compete, no matter how accurate our book is, with Charlie Wilson's War. That's the power of Hollywood and the dream power, which is the subliminal level at which we all accept the story. It's more like it's a different frame of reference than when you're.
It's like a felt thought. It's not really something you could necessarily think logically about too much. It's also dealing with these deeper felt states that affect how we feel about information that is packaged or in a certain framed way, that we don't even know why we feel a certain way. Like, oh, I hear a Russian voice, it must be a bad guy.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
I mean, they've even done it to the Muppets, unfortunately. I mean,
everything's
Muppets would make movies every so often, and I recall about 4 or 5 years ago finding a Muppets movie for my grandkids, and it was the bad guys were now the Russians. Okay.
Oh no,
not Soviets, Russians.
It was like it all started. It's like you can tell when the shift occurs that what's going on in terms of the Dream Factory. Okay, the Dream Factory shifted over to anti-Russian propaganda around 2007, 2008, and it's in movies. It's no longer the Nazis; it's the Russians who are the bad guys. So you can track it once you have the scorecard and you say, oh, I know what that is. I know who's telling me that. And that's where the neocons come in, because they're a close-knit unit and they work together in various ways, in various places. I mean, we got to the one person you can get to in Hollywood. That was Oliver Stone. And we went to him after his movie JFK came out, because we're connected to the JFK story. And he said, I don't want JFK. We came out with a deep background story about JFK. He said, I don't want that. I've already done JFK. I want Afghanistan. What can you give me? So we gave him our story, modified to suit the screen in Afghanistan, and tried working with him for a few years, but there was nobody else to work with. I mean, as soon as we pulled away because we didn't like the direction he was taking with it, but he was the guy, and he was powerful enough. He could have got something done, clearly, but there was nobody else who was interested. And even to this day, Hollywood still remains, the existing narrative is Charlie Wilson's war.
Yeah, absolutely. No, Hollywood is it's beyond compromised at this point. I mean, if there were outliers here or there throughout the years, I can't see anything that's not tainted with some nefarious political intention behind it at this point, in terms of what's approved and turned into multi-million-dollar productions. That being said, for our last little segment, I was hoping, since you've just touched on, you've touched on Afghanistan. Oliver Stone is somebody who did a movie on Alexander the Great, which obviously overlaps a little bit with Afghanistan too. And you guys have been bringing up something known as, especially in your books on Valediction 1 and 2, the idea of mystical imperialism. I think that sort of ties things together a little pretty nicely in a basket here. For the last little 8-9 minute burst of time we have available to us, what is mystical imperialism? How does this package in or tie together this story?
Well, I've come up with a very straightforward way of understanding mystical imperialism. What we're dealing with, we always talk about as empire, and imperialism is expression of empire. But we the people are not aware of the fact that the actual power of empire is mystical power. That is where it comes from. And you said, but there's a place. Well, the place, that's part of the dream power, the part of the imaginal realm. It is actually the ability to create a thought that then other people believe in and start acting on. You create a story. You are literally creating and using mystical power. All right. Well, imperialists are masters of using mystical power. And they've done such a good job of controlling that realm. They've convinced people that you can't use that realm because you're just a peon. You've got to be a royal like me, or you've got to come from the right kind of understanding. And so the average person has literally given over. I mean, I think I remember hearing that in the Catholic Church, you're supposed to tell your dreams to your priest. You're not supposed to interpret them yourself. Well, why would they need to have, kind of an idea of control of your dreams? It's all part of that decommissioning process, so that you don't use the power yourself. You literally give it to them. You give it to whatever. It doesn't matter which religion we're talking about. This process is a fact of all religions, that they are dealing in this mystical realm. And that's why when you look at the story between what was going with Thomas Becket as an example and Henry, the whole battle was between the power of the priesthood and that realm and the physical realm that the king controlled, and the whole idea that there was a battle going on. So that was the marriage, in fact, that the Church of England fulfilled by bringing the church and giving it to the royal. So there was no longer a priest in between effect.
So the head of the state was also the head of the church.
And so he controlled the spiritual realm, which is this is the realm we're talking about. And that's where the imperial power comes from. But you can see that the imperial power is their use of it. The average person is not going to use it in this horrific way. We use it for the purpose of fulfilling our lives as people, as average people, normal people. They're not, and they have become, I think, at this point, it's almost like they're so saturated in this power that they can't do anything but misuse it at this point.
Yeah, and I'm gonna have to have you guys talk about the dynamics of the British Israelite movement from the Kabbalists of Francesco Giorgi onward at some future point to scratch on this a little bit more in detail, because I think it is super valuable. But Paul, you were about to say something, and then I have a question about Afghanistan. So go ahead.
When I mentioned that document, the CIA document, PSB, it stands for Psychological Strategy Board. That's what it was called back in the time, back in the early 1950s. And that's what the CIA was strategizing as to how to establish a cultural umbrella that everything could fit in. And so that's how you get the news, that's how you get plays, that's how you get theater, you get motion pictures, and you get education. And so the children would be educated into this realm, if you want to call it that, of controlled by the Psychological Strategy Board. So it even tested. I remember in 5th grade when they came in with the Psychological Testing Corporation tests. Yeah. I was in 5th grade, and you had to take it. And it was very unusual from what we'd experienced before. You had to do them within a certain period of time. You were limited. It was like the SATs and LSATs. But it was not my first encounter with them, and it was very strictly done. And the teachers in many cases didn't do it correctly. They weren't rigid enough in terms of the discipline that they used when they actually gave you that. So they had to come back and do them again, enhanced the discipline. You had to do it exactly the way the Psychological Strategy Board wanted it done. So, it was all there. We just never really, bit by bit, you see, as I said, you keep bumping into these things. Like when we went to this, when Ted Kennedy was running for president against Jimmy Carter in 1980. We were introduced to someone from the campaign who was helping out with the campaign, and he'd run Bobby Kennedy's campaign, a guy by the name of Al Lowenstein. And so he said, since you're a Fitzgerald, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, since you're a Fitzgerald, and we are related distantly, and he said, I can tell you this. He said, I've done a lot of research into JFK's assassination as well as Bobby's assassination, but we've got to get Ted elected because I've got the people willing to come forward and tell the public who those CIA sons of bitches were that did this. And he said, but they need the protection of the presidency. They need Ted to be president in order to do it. And 2 weeks later, a man walked into his office that he knew, done in New York City, and shot him about 11 times. Okay. Yeah. Put the gun down and waited for the police to come. Mm-hmm. So talk about psychological strategy. Ted, needless to say, did not win the nomination in 1980 for president, even though he challenged him, and a lot of people wanted him to revive the Kennedy legend. But there are so many things that have been working against the American people, I would say, and public disclosure of some of the darker sides of what's actually running our government. And I think we're seeing a lot of that right now. I think it can't be hidden any longer.
But it's so overwhelming because people have been so successfully shuttered out of so much.
Right.
It's hard for them to believe some of the things they're now having to accept. But I remember clearly when the pedophile story broke on the Catholic Church in early 2000s, there was still an awful lot of Catholics to the minute it happened never could accept that it was real. So this is part of what we're dealing with, is this literal denial and sense of overwhelm. So that's why I think what you're trying to do with this is so important, Matt. Connecting the bigger dots so people can see a pattern and begin to understand how it happened.
Yeah, definitely. No, and with real knowledge is a power that you don't have if you're ignorant of something, whether it's about yourself subjectively or about the world outside you. Usually there's a connection of the two, and ignorance comes no power to change it yourself or the external. So I think what you guys are bringing together is really, really high value. If people want to read your books, I highly suggest starting with Valediction, 3 Nights of Desmond, Valediction, Resurrection, also available. Anything else you want to say in the last 15 seconds?
Well, we've got a website called valediction.net. We've got a lot of information on there that you can sort through and figure out.
To hear